What I'm trying to say is, I have said this, you've said this, Christians have said this kind of thing for a long time, that we have a vision for the world, and that's good. But if we have a vision for the world, while people are starving in our own backyard, we've got our priorities out of order. We've got to care for those right here within our own arm's reach, as well as not lose a burden for things going on anywhere else around the world either. We want to be a light all around the world, but certainly if God has planted us here and this community all around us, then let's labor to the glory of God and say we're going to care for these outside the walls of our own church building because we're trying to get the gospel to people. It's not just social work. It's not just humanitarian. It's getting the gospel to people with love and compassion and tenderness. That's what it is. You know, I read a story about a children's home. A children's home. Who knows? Maybe that's something Friendship ought to consider getting into. I don't know. We ought to pray and ask the Lord. But I read about a children's home. You know, we live in an area where just down the road from us there's 4,200 homeless children in Charlotte, North Carolina. And all of Charlotte's moving this direction. You know, things to pray about. What do we do, Lord? But nevertheless, Mr. Spurgeon had the Stockwell Orphanage. And one day an American went overseas and he toured London and he toured the Metropolitan Tabernacle. The church, and by the way, it wasn't Spurgeon that had the orphanage. The church had the orphanage. I want to be clear. It was the church's work. But nevertheless, Mr. Spurgeon took the American on a tour of the orphanage. And the American wrote about the experience, and this is what he said. He said when the preacher went in through the gates and into the doors of the orphanage, all the boys come running up to him because they were just lit up. They were just so happy to see him. And he said, as I watched, I understood why. Because the preacher talked to them. He called every one of them by name, took a moment for every child, made them feel like they were the most important human being on the face of God's earth. He took a little piece of money out of his pocket and gave to every one of those boys. And you can imagine how they just lit up and beamed with a little piece of money. You know, he said it was a shilling. I don't know what a shilling would be in our day, but nevertheless, that's what he gave to them. And he said they walked around the property and then they went into the infirmary, the sick area. And there was a little boy who was in one of the beds. He was dying of tuberculosis. And the little child was lying there weak, coughing, dying. Mr. Spurgeon went over there and sat down beside of this little boy. Remember, Mr. Spurgeon was a man who preached to thousands on a weekly basis. But for that moment, he wasn't thinking of thousands. He had one little boy in his eyes. He sat down on his bed beside the child. He took the little boy's hand. He began to talk to the boy like he was his own son. The Americans watching this. Mr. Spurgeon talked to the boy and told him, and said along these words. He said, now son, soon you'll die. And you're going to go to be with Jesus. And the Lord is going to meet you there. Don't you worry, son. Everything's going to be just fine. And son, I want you to just trust Jesus now. He's not going to fail you. You trust Jesus. And then he looked up there to the nurse. Nurse, did he have a good night last night? Nurse, were there things we can get him, things to help him, make him comfortable? He said, nurse, you know, I think this young man would love a beautiful songbird, a little canary sitting here by his bed to just sing to him in the mornings. Would you please make sure that there's a canary here for in the morning? And then he prayed with the little boy. The American watching all of this, and this is what he said. He said, this man that I preached to thousands and could command an army with his voice. In that moment, I've never seen a grander or greater man than one who just stopped to care for one little dying boy. Can I ask you something, church? Don't you believe that there's people hurting all around us? What is God's answer? God's answer is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the love of Christ. And how did God ordain that people get that gospel and they draw close? How did God ordain? He ordained a church to be His body on the earth. I'm going to make a statement here. Listen. The church cannot outsource its work. God gave us the responsibility. We have to be a working church. Let's bow together for a word of prayer. May we please?